Hello. In this video, we will discuss photosynthesis. Focus will be on both the light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions, which are also known as the Calvin cycle. Photosynthetic organisms are considered producers. They are considered producers because they make their own source of chemical energy. And recall that producers are found towards the bottom of the food chain. Plants are an example of this and use photosynthesis as the primary means of obtaining their energy. They do this through capturing energy from the sunlight and converting it to sugar. Within plants is a cell organelle called chloroplast. Chloroplasts contain a molecule called chlorophyll. It is this molecule of chlorophyll that absorbs the light energy. Photosynthesis takes place within two parts of chloroplast. The first part is the grana, which consists of stacked thylakoids. The second part is the stroma, which is a gel-like matrix. This gel-like matrix makes up the majority of the chloroplast and provides support and structure to it. And finally, recall that the equation for photosynthesis consists of carbon dioxide, water, and light energy, which is chemically combined to yield sugar in the form of glucose and oxygen gas. So, as a brief recap, photosynthesis typically occurs in the leaf of the plant, where the plant leaf cells contain many chloroplasts. It is these chloroplasts which is broken into the stroma and the granium, which are composed of disc-like structures called thylakoids, where the two processes of photosynthesis, light reaction and Calvin cycle, take place. If we look at an entire chloroplast as depicted in this diagram here, notice that we can make out the thylakoid where the light-dependent reactions occur, and the gel-like matrix called the stroma, where the Calvin cycle occurs. Both of these processes make up photosynthesis. In general, the light reactions involve taking light energy and water and producing oxygen gas as a byproduct, ATP and NADPH, which are energy-carrying molecules. These two energy-carrying molecules, which come from the light-dependent reactions, are then used in the stroma in the Calvin cycle, where CO2 is brought in, and our sugar is produced. Notice that photosynthesis can be broken into two primary reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. The light-dependent reactions can further be broken down into four processes: photosystem 2, the electron transport chain, photosystem 1, and the creation of energy-carrying molecules. In our next section of notes, we will look at the light-dependent reactions with a focus on photosystem 2, the electron transport chain, photosystem 1, and energy-carrying molecules. As we look at the light-dependent reactions, we're first going to look at photosystem 2 and the electron transport chain. Step 1 and Step 2 occur simultaneously, but we'll begin with Step 1, which is energy that is absorbed from sunlight and transferred to electrons that have entered into the electron transport chain. Step 2 is where water molecules are broken down, and the electrons from the broken down water molecule is going to then enter into the chlorophyll, where it is energized by the energy from the sunlight from Step 1 and moves into the electron transport chain. So a couple of things that I want you to notice here. First of all, notice that the water, H2O, is found in the stroma. Water is broken down into its basic parts, which is an oxygen atom, two hydrogen ions, which are nothing more than protons, and two electrons. And it's these two electrons that are going to be taken up into the chlorophyll, which are then energized by sunlight And once they have been energized, they are then going to move into the electron transport chain. Now, once the electrons have moved into the electron transport chain, that energy is going to be used to pump the hydrogen ions found in the stroma that was broken down from our water across the thylakoid membrane and to the inside of the thylakoid. Because energy is being utilized to move these hydrogen ions across the membrane, this is going to be a form of active transport. Remember, ions are not something that can freely move across a cell membrane or an organelle's membrane. So there's energy that is needed and necessary for that to occur. As these hydrogen ions are moved across the membrane, they're going to begin to build in concentration, and we'll come back and look at these hydrogen ions in subsequent steps. At the conclusion of photosystem 2, the electrons are still going to be found in the electron transport chain. They are going to once again move back into chlorophyll, where energy absorbed from sunlight is going to be transferred to the electrons. These electrons, which are now considered high energy electrons, are going to be used in photosystem 1 to produce a molecule called NADPH. NADPH is made from NADP+. Electrons are added to the NADP+, creating a bond between the phosphorus and the hydrogen. And this chemical bond is where energy is going to be stored. So the hydrogen ions that we pumped across into the thylakoid back in photosystem 2 have been building up in concentration. And eventually this concentration is going to become so great that they have to move back out into the stroma in order to reach a point of equilibrium. Now, because they're ions, they can't freely move back and forth that bilipid layer of phospholipids. So they're going to need some help. This is where a protein channel is going to come into play. Now, because this is a movement of high concentration to low concentration, it's going to be considered diffusion. Because there's a protein involved that doesn't require the use of energy to move the hydrogen ions, this will be an example of facilitated diffusion. So notice here in step 6 that we have our protein channel, and it is spanning the entire thylakoid membrane. Our hydrogen ions are located up here in a high concentration, and they're going to move down through this protein channel. Now, this particular protein channel is a protein that is known as ATP synthase. ATP synthase is a protein that changes ADP into ATP. So ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is a molecule that has 2 phosphate molecules attached to it. As the hydrogen ions move down through here, they're going to lower the activation energy required to attach an additional phosphate molecule to our ADP. By doing so, they're changing ADP into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is another high energy molecule. ATP is probably most commonly known as the molecule produced in the mitochondria, which most of you, I would hope, know is considered the powerhouse of the cell. But the mitochondria doesn't have a monopoly on the production of ATP. ATP is produced elsewhere in the cell, and this is one example of where it's produced. So, at the end of our light-dependent reaction, we have 2 energy-carrying molecules that are produced. The first is NADPH, and the second is ATP. and is a byproduct of stripping our water molecule down in order to get those electrons that were used in the electron transport chain and to get those hydrogen ions that were used in the production of ATP and NADPH. Our oxygen atoms are going to combine and form oxygen gas and be given off as a byproduct. The ATP and NADPH are going to carry the energy in their chemical bonds out into the stroma, which is where the Calvin cycle is going to take place. As the energy-carrying molecules leave the light-dependent reactions and enter into the stroma, they then become a part of the light-independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle. The first step in the Calvin cycle is carbon fixation. Carbon fixation occurs when carbon dioxide from the atmosphere enters into the cell and is broken apart. If you recall back to the carbon cycle, carbon fixation is a part of the carbon cycle. In the second step, the reduction phase, energy is added to the molecules in the cycle from the ATP and the NADPH. The molecules are rearranged into higher energy molecules containing more carbon atoms. The energy is found between the bonds of the carbon. In the third step, carbohydrate formation, high energy 3-carbon molecules are going to leave the Calvin cycle. 2 of these will be bonded together in order to make a 6-carbon sugar, also known as glucose. However, not all of the 3-carbon molecules will leave the cycle. Some will remain in the cycle and move to the 4th stage, which is the regeneration phase, where energy is once again added to the molecules remaining in the cycle in order to change them into a 5-carbon molecule that then begins the Calvin cycle over again. As we look at a slightly more detailed example of the Calvin cycle, I want to introduce you to a molecule known as RUBP. RUBP is the molecule that is going to break apart our carbon dioxide, pulling the carbon off and then splitting into 2 3-carbon molecules. Another example of this is this diagram of the Calvin cycle, where this 5-carbon molecule, this is our RUBP, is going to have energy from ATP and ADP come in and be utilized to break it apart, adding our carbon from CO2, resulting in these 2 3-carbon molecules. Now, one of these 3-carbon molecules is going to once again have more energy from ATP brought in, where an additional phosphate is going to be attached. NADPH is going to again bring energy in, and these G3P molecules are going to break off and go down and form our glucose. The big picture of this that you need to notice and follow is that energy is being transferred through chemical reactions from one molecule to the next, and carbon is being transformed from a state of where it's unusable by organisms into a molecule that can be used by organisms and taken up. So as a final look back at photosynthesis, remember, photosynthesis occurs in the leaf. It occurs in the chloroplast of the plant cell, and it is broken down into 2 parts. The first of which are light reactions, where light energy and water come in, oxygen is given off as a byproduct, and 2 energy-carrying molecules, NADPH and ATP, are produced and moved into the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is occurring in the stroma of the chloroplast. Carbon dioxide is found in here, and energy from NADPH and ATP are utilized to transform the carbon dioxide into a molecule that can be used by the plant and by other organisms that consume the plant in the form of sugar.